Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Dream through history, step back into the 14th century, where every dawn brought new terror. When famine starved millions, plague killed the rest, and feudal laws punished those who begged for more than scraps. Today we present a story of struggle, revolt, and desperate survival in the heart of medieval Europe. This isn't legend, it's the reality of a dark age world. The Great Famine, when crops failed and hunger raged between 1315 and 1317, Europe faced devastation like never before. Endless rain turned fields into mud, crops rotted before harvest, and livestock died in droves. Men, women, and children starved. Crime soared. Some were driven to infanticide or even cannibalism just to survive. The Great Famine shattered faith and trust in both lords and the church. The Great Famine, when crops failed and hunger raged between 1315 and 1317, Europe faced devastation like never before. Endless rain turned fields into mud, crops rotted before harvest, and livestock died in droves. Men, women, and children starved. Crime soared. Some were driven to infanticide or even cannibalism just to survive. The Great Famine shattered faith and trust in both lords and the church. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, occasionally dated 1315 to 1322, was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck parts of Europe early in the 14th century. Most of Europe, extending east to Poland and south to the Alps, was affected. The famine caused many deaths over an extended number of years and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the 11th to the 13th centuries. The Great Famine started with bad weather in spring, 1315. Crop failures lasted through 1316 until the summer harvest in 1317, and Europe did not fully recover until 1322. Crop failures were not the only problem. Cattle disease caused sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80%. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. The crisis had consequences for the church, state, European society, and for future calamities to follow in the 14th century. Famines were familiar occurrences in medieval Europe. For example, localized famines occurred in the Kingdom of France during the 14th century in 1304, 1305, 1310, 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine, 1330 to 1334, 1349 to 1351, 1358, 1360, 1371, 1374 to 1375, and 1390. In the Kingdom of England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the Great Famine, there were additional famines in 1321, 1351, and 1369, according to official records about the English royal family. An example of the best off in society, for whom records were kept. The average life expectancy at birth in 1276 was 35.28 years. Between 1301 and 1325, during the Great Famine, it was 29.84 years, but between 1348 and 1375, during the plague, it was only 17.33 years. The average life expectancy figures are skewed by child mortality rates, which were naturally high even during non-famine years. However, this demonstrates the steep population drop between 1348 and 1375 of about 42%. During the medieval warm period, 10th to 13th centuries, the population of Europe exploded, compared to prior eras and reached levels that were not matched again in some places until the 19th century. Indeed, parts of rural France are still less populous than in the early 14th century. The yield ratios of wheat, the number of seeds one could harvest and consume per seed planted, had been dropping since 1280, and food prices had been increasing. After favorable harvests, the ratio could be as high as 7 to 1, but after unfavorable harvests, it was as low as 2 to 1, that is, for every seed planted, 2 seeds were harvested, 1 for next year's seed and 1 for food. By comparison, modern farming has ratios of 30 to 1 or more. See agricultural productivity. The onset of the Great Famine followed the end of the medieval warm period. Between 1310 and 1330, Northern Europe saw some of the worst and most sustained periods of bad weather in the Middle Ages, characterized by severe winters and rainy and cold summers. The Great Famine may have been precipitated by a volcanic event and occurred during the Little Ice Age. Changing weather patterns. The ineffectiveness of medieval governments in dealing with crises and population level at a historical high made it a time with little margin for error in food production. Great Famine. The spring of 1315. Unusually heavy rain began in much of Europe. Throughout the spring and the summer, it continued to rain, and the temperature remained cool. Under such conditions, grain could not ripen, leading to widespread crop failures. Grains were brought indoors in urns and pots to keep dry. The straw and hay for the animals could not be cured, so there was no fodder for the livestock. The soil became extremely moist from the heavy rain, making it impossible to plough the fields ready for planting. In England, lowlands in Yorkshire and Nottingham were flooded, while stew ponds on the River Foss in Yorkshire were washed away. The price of food began to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. Salt, the only way to cure and preserve meat, was difficult to obtain because brine could not be effectively evaporated in wet weather. As a result, its price increased from 30 to 40 shillings. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by 320%, making bread unaffordable to peasants. Stores of grain for long-term emergencies were limited to royalty, lords, nobles, wealthy merchants, and the church. Because of the general increased population pressures, even lower than average harvests meant some people would go hungry. There was little margin for failure. People began to harvest wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark in the forests. A number of documented incidents show the extent of the famine. Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans on 10 August 1315 and had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. It was a rare occasion in which the King of England was unable to eat. In Bristol, the city's chronicles reported that in 1315 there was a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horseflesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison and devoured them half alive. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but in low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became bogged down and were forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they abandoned them, unable to carry them away. In spring 1316, it continued to rain on a European population deprived of energy and reserves. To sustain itself, all segments of society from nobles to peasants were affected, but especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and who had no reserve food supplies. To provide some measure of relief, the future was mortgaged by slaughtering the draft animals eating the seed grain, abandoning children to fend for themselves, see Hansel and Gretel, and among old people, voluntary starvation so that the younger generation could continue to work the fields. The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents of cannibalism. It was reported that during the famine, people would open the graves of the newly dead and claim them as food, though one can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumor-mongering. As Lynn H. Nelson comments, the height of the famine was in 1317, as the wet weather continued. In that summer, the weather returned to normal patterns. By then, people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten, that it was not until 1325 that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died, though the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, would kill more people. It often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the populace. Jean-Pierre Leguet noted the Great Famine produced wholesale slaughter in a world that was already overcrowded, especially in the towns, which were natural outlets for rural overpopulation. Estimates of death rates vary by place, but some examples include a loss of 10 to 15% in the south of England. Northern France lost about 10% of its population. A number of documented incidents show the extent of the famine. Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans on the 10th of August, 1315, and had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. It was a rare occasion in which the King of England was unable to eat. In Bristol, the city's chronicles reported that in 1315 there was a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horseflesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison and devoured them half alive. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but in low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became bogged down and were forced to retreat, burning their provisions where they abandoned them, unable to carry them away. In spring 1316, it continued to rain on a European population deprived of energy and reserves to sustain itself. All segments of society, from nobles to peasants, were affected, but especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and who had no reserve food supplies. To provide some measure of relief, the future was mortgaged by slaughtering the draft animals, eating the seed grain, abandoning children to fend for themselves, see Hansel and Gretel, and among old people, voluntary starvation, so that the younger generation could continue to work the fields. The chroniclers of the time noted many incidents of cannibalism. It was reported that during the famine, people would open the graves of the newly dead and claim them as food, though one can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumor-mongering. As Lynn H. Nelson comments, the height of the famine was in 1317, as the wet weather continued. In that summer, the weather returned to normal patterns. By then, people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stock had been eaten, that it was not until 1325 that the food supply returned to relatively normal levels and the population began to increase. Historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that 10 to 25% of the population of many cities and towns died, though the Black Death, 1347 to 1351 would kill more people. It often swept through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the populace. Jean-Pierre Leguay noted the Great Famine produced wholesale slaughter in a world that was already overcrowded, especially in the towns, which were natural outlets for rural overpopulation. Estimates of death rates vary by place, but some examples include a loss of 10 to 15% in the south of England. Northern France lost about 10% of its population. Geography and hydroclimate context. The Great Famine was restricted to northern Europe, including the British Isles, northern France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Germany, and western Poland. It also affected some of the Baltic states, except for the far eastern Baltic, which was affected only indirectly. The famine was bounded to the south by the Alps and the Pyrenees. The 1314 to 1316 period was the fifth wettest 3-year interval in Europe from 1300 to 2012. Of the 4 wetter periods, 3 occurred after 1710, when agricultural technology was much more productive, while 1 occurred after the Black Death, when population size had already been reduced. The Great Famine's exceptional severity was due to extreme precipitation, coinciding with peak medieval population and pre-industrial agriculture, creating an extreme vulnerability to sustained adverse weather consequences. The Great Famine is noteworthy for the number of people who died, the vast geographic area that was affected, its length, and its lasting consequences. Nearly all human societies at this time attributed natural disasters as being divine retribution for their apparent misdeeds. In a society whose final recourse for nearly all problems had been religion, and Roman Catholicism was the only tolerated Christian faith, no amount of prayer seemed effective against the root causes of the famine. Thus the famine undermined the institutional authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and helped lay the foundations for later movements that were deemed heretical by the Roman Catholic Church, as they opposed the papacy and blamed the perceived failure of prayer upon corruption and doctrinal errors within the Roman Catholic Church. Cultural medieval Europe in the 14th century had already experienced widespread social violence, and even acts then punishable by death, such as rape and murder, were demonstrably far more common, especially relative to the population size. Compared with modern times, the famine led to a stark increase in crime, even among those not normally inclined to criminal activity, because people would resort to any means to feed themselves or their families. For the next several decades after the famine, Europe took on a tougher and more violent edge. It became an even less amicable place than during the 12th and the 13th centuries. This could be seen across all segments of society, perhaps most strikingly in the way warfare was conducted in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, when chivalry ended, as opposed to the 12th and the 13th centuries, when nobles were more likely to die by accident in tournament games than on the field of battle. The famine undermined confidence in medieval governments due to their failure to deal with its resulting crisis. This had particularly dire consequences for Edward II of England, who was already an unpopular monarch. While the famine was seen as divine retribution both in England and on the continent, the English were more inclined to blame their misfortune on the perceived misrule and immorality of the king as opposed to alleged misconduct within the church. This contributed to his downfall in 1327. Citation needed. Population. The Great Famine ended an era of unprecedented population growth that had started circa 1050. Although some believe growth had already been slowing down for several decades, The famine brought this period to an undisputed conclusion. The Great Famine's impacts also affected future events in the 14th century, such as the Black Death, when an already weakened population would suffer an additional calamity, the Black Death, death in the streets in 1347. The bubonic plague hit Europe later, called the Black Death. Within 5 years, 30 to 50% of populations perished. Victims developed swollen black buboes, fever, and joint pain. Burial pits overflowed as mass deaths became daily news. Society collapsed under fear and grief. The Black Death was a bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Europe from 1346 to 1353. It was one of the most fatal pandemics in human history. As many as 50 million people perished, perhaps 50% of Europe's 14th century population. The disease is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread by fleas and through the air. One of the most significant events in European history, the Black Death had far-reaching population, economic, and cultural impacts. It was the beginning of the Second Plague Pandemic. The plague created religious, social, and economic upheavals, with profound effects on the course of European history. The origin of the Black Death is disputed. Genetic analysis suggests Yersinia pestis bacteria evolved approximately 7,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Neolithic, with flea-mediated strains emerging around 3,800 years ago during the Late Bronze Age. The immediate territorial origins of the Black Death and its outbreak remain unclear, with some evidence pointing towards Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Europe. The pandemic was reportedly first introduced to Europe during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea by the Golden Horde, army of Johnny Beg in 1347. From Crimea, it was most likely carried by fleas living on the black rats that travelled on Genoese ships, spreading through the Mediterranean basin and reaching North Africa, West Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. There is evidence that once it came ashore, the Black Death mainly spread from person to person as pneumonic plague, thus explaining the quick inland spread of the epidemic, which was faster than would be expected if the primary vector was rat fleas causing bubonic plague. In 2022, it was discovered that there was a sudden surge of deaths in what is today Kyrgyzstan from the Black Death in the late 1330s. When combined with genetic evidence, this implies that the initial spread may have been unrelated to the 14th century. Mongol conquests previously postulated as the cause. The Black Death was the second great natural disaster to strike Europe during the late Middle Ages, the first one being the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and is estimated to have killed 30% to 60% of the European population, as well as approximately 33% of the population of the Middle East. There were further outbreaks throughout the late Middle Ages, and also due to other contributing factors, the crisis of the late Middle Ages. The European population did not regain its 14th century level until the 16th century AA. Outbreaks of the plague recurred around the world until the early 19th century. European writers, contemporary with the plague, described the disease in Latin as pestis, or pestilentia, pestilence, epidemia, epidemic, mortalitas, mortality. In English, prior to the 18th century, the event was called the pestilence, or Great Pestilence, the plague, or the Great Death. Subsequent to the pandemic, the first marine, or first pestilence was applied to distinguish the mid-14th century phenomenon from other infectious diseases and epidemics of plague. The 1347 pandemic plague was not referred to specifically as black at the time in any European language. The expression Black Death had occasionally been applied to other fatal or dangerous diseases. In English, Black Death was not used to describe this plague pandemic, however, until the 1750s. The term is first attested in 1755, where it translated Danish, den, sort dud, lit, the Black Death. This expression, as a proper name for the pandemic, had been popularized by Swedish and Danish chroniclers in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and in the 16th and 17th centuries it was transferred to other languages as a calque: Icelandic, Svartidawi, German, der, Schwarz, Todd, and French, le mort noir. Previously, most European languages had named the pandemic a variant or calque of the Latin Magna Mortalitas, lit, Great Death. The phrase Black Death, describing death as black, is very old. Homer used it in the Odyssey to describe the monstrous Scylla. With her mouths full of black death, ancient Greek, pi, lambda, epsilon, omicron, iota, mu I, lambda, alpha, nu omicron, sigma theta, alpha, nu y, tau omicron, iota, omicron, homenized ple. Oi melanosthanatoiu. Seneca the Younger may have been the first to describe an epidemic as Black Death, Latin, mors atra, but only in reference to the acute lethality and dark prognosis of disease. The 12th-13th century French physician Gilles de Corbel had already used atremors to refer to a pestilential fever, febris pestilentialis, in his work on the signs and symptoms of diseases, De Signis et Symptomatibus. The phrase mors nigra, Black Death, was used in 1350 by Simon de Covino, or Cuvin, a Belgian astronomer, in his poem on the judgment of the sun at a feast of Saturn de Judicio, Solis in Convivio Saturni, which attributes the plague to an astrological conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. His use of the phrase is not connected unambiguously with the plague pandemic of 1347 and appears to refer to the fatal outcome of disease. The historian Elizabeth Penrose, writing under the pen name Mrs. Markham, described the 14th century outbreak as the Black Death in 1823. The historian Cardinal Francis Aidan Gasquet wrote about the Great Pestilence in 1893 and suggested that it had been some form of the ordinary Eastern or bubonic plague. In 1908, Gasquet said, use of the name etremors for the 14th century epidemic first appeared in a 1631 book on Danish history by J.I. Pontanus, commonly and from its effects. They called it the Black Death, vulgo and ab effectu, atrium mortem vocitabunt, previous. Plague epidemics research from 2017 suggests plague first infected humans in Europe and Asia in the late Neolithic early Bronze Age. Researched in 2018 found evidence of Yersinia pestis in an ancient Swedish tomb, which may have been associated with the Neolithic decline around 3000 BCE, in which European populations fell significantly. This Y. pestis may have been different from more modern types, with bubonic plague transmissible by fleas first known from Bronze Age, remains near Samara. The symptoms of bubonic plague are first attested in a fragment of Rufus's of Ephesus, preserved by Oribasius. These ancient medical authorities suggest bubonic plague had appeared in the Roman Empire before the reign of Trajan, 6 centuries before arriving at Pelusium in the reign of Justinian I in 2013. Researchers confirmed earlier speculation that the cause of the plague of Justinian 541 to 549 CE, with recurrences until 750, was Y. pestis. This is known as the first plague pandemic. In 610, the Chinese physician Chao Yuanfang described a malignant bubo coming in abruptly with high fever, together with the appearance of a bundle of nodes beneath the tissue. The Chinese physician Sun Simo, who died in 652, also mentioned a malignant bubo and plague that was common in Lingnong Guangzhou. Oljurgen Benedicto believes that this indicates it was an offshoot of the first plague pandemic, which made its way eastward to Chinese territory by around 600. Main article: Theories of the Black Death. A report by the medical faculty of Paris stated that a conjunction of planets had caused a great pestilence in the air. Miasma theory. Muslim religious scholars taught that the pandemic was a martyrdom and mercy from God, assuring the believers' place in paradise. For non-believers, it was a punishment. Page needed some Muslim doctors cautioned against trying to prevent or treat a disease sent by God. Others adopted preventive measures and treatments for plague used by Europeans. These Muslim doctors also depended on the writings of the ancient Greeks due to climate change in Asia. Rodents began to flee the dried-out grasslands to more populated areas, spreading the disease, the plague disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is zootic, commonly present in populations of fleas carried by ground rodents, including marmots, in various areas, including Central Asia, Kurdistan, West Asia, North India, Uganda, and the western United States. Why? Pestis was discovered by Alexander Yersin, a pupil of Louis Pasteur, during an epidemic of bubonic plague in Hong Kong in 1894. Yersin also proved this bacterium was present in rodents and suggested the rat was the main vehicle of transmission. The mechanism by which Y. pestis is usually transmitted was established in 1898 by Paul Louis Simond and was found to involve the bites of fleas whose midguts had become obstructed by replicating Y. pestis several days after feeding on an infected host. This blockage starves the fleas, drives them to aggressive feeding behavior, and causes them to try to clear the blockage via regurgitation, resulting in thousands of plague bacteria flushing into the feeding site and infecting the host. The bubonic plague mechanism was also dependent on two populations of rodents, one resistant to the disease, which act as hosts, keeping the disease endemic, and a second that lacks resistance. When the second population dies, the fleas move on to other hosts, including people, thus creating a human epidemic. Definitive confirmation of the role of Y. pestis arrived in 2010 with a publication in PLOS Pathogens by Hench et al. They assessed the presence of DNA, RNA with polymerase chain reaction PCR techniques for Y. pestis from the tooth sockets in human skeletons from mass graves in northern, central, and southern Europe that were associated archaeologically with the Black Death and subsequent resurgences. The authors concluded that this new research, together with prior analyses from the south of France and Germany, ends the debate about the cause of the Black Death, and unambiguously demonstrates that Y. pestis was the causative agent of the epidemic plague that devastated Europe during the Middle Ages. In 2011, these results were further confirmed with genetic evidence derived from Black Death victims in the East Smithfield burial site in England. Schunemann et al. Concluded in 2011 that the Black Death in medieval Europe was caused by a variant of Y. pestis that may no longer exist. Later, in 2011, Boss et al. Reported in Nature the first draft genome of Y. pestis from plague victims from the same East Smithfield cemetery and indicated that the strain that caused the Black Death is ancestral to most modern strains of Y. pestis. Later genomic papers have further confirmed the phylogenetic placement of the Y. pestis strain responsible for the Black Death. as both the ancestor of later plague epidemics, including the third plague pandemic, canned, the descendant of the strain responsible for the plague of Justinian. In addition, plague genomes from prehistory have been recovered. DNA taken from 25 skeletons from 14th century London showed that plague is a strain of Y. pestis, almost identical to that which hit Madagascar in 2013. Further DNA evidence also proves the role of Y. pestis and traces the source to the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan. Alternative explanations, researchers, are hampered by a lack of reliable statistics from this period. Most work has been done on the spread of the disease in England, where estimates of overall population at the start of the plague vary by over 100%. As no census was undertaken in England between the time of publication of the Domesday Book of 1086 and the poll tax of the year 1377, estimates of plague victims are usually extrapolated from figures for the clergy. Mathematical modelling is used to match the spreading patterns and the means of transmission. In 2018, researchers suggested an alternative model in which the disease was spread from human fleas and body lice to other people. The second model claims to better fit the trends of the plague's death toll, as the rat-for-human hypothesis would have produced a delayed but very high spike in deaths. Contradicting historical death data, the oriental rat flea has poor survival in cooler climates, and re-evaluation suggests the Humian flea was the principal vector of plague epidemics in northern Europe. Lars Wally argued that these authors take it for granted that Simon's infection model, black rat gives rat, flea gives human, which was developed to explain the spread of plague in India, is the only way an epidemic of Yersinia pestis infection could spread. Similarly, Monica Green has argued that greater attention is needed to the range of especially non-commensal animals that might be involved in the transmission of plague. Archaeologist Barney Sloan has argued that there is insufficient evidence of the extinction of numerous rats in the archaeological record of the medieval waterfront in London, and that the disease spread too quickly to support the thesis that Y. pestis was spread from fleas on rats. He argues that transmission must have been person to person. This theory is supported by research in 2018 which suggested transmission was more likely by body lice and fleas during the second plague pandemic. Summary academic debate continues, but no single alternative explanation for the plague's spread has achieved widespread acceptance. Many scholars arguing for Y. pestis as the major agent of the pandemic suggest that its extent and symptoms can be explained by a combination of bubonic plague with other diseases, including typhus, smallpox, and respiratory infections. In addition to the bubonic infection, others point to additional septicemic and pneumonic forms of plague, which lengthen the duration of outbreaks throughout the seasons and help account for its high mortality rate and additional recorded symptoms. In 2014, Public Health England announced the results of an examination of 25 bodies exhumed in the Clerkenwell area of London, as well as of wills registered in London during the period, which supported the pneumonic hypothesis. Currently, while osteoarchaeologists have conclusively verified the presence of Y. pestis bacteria in burial sites across northern Europe through examination of bones and dental pulp, no other epidemic pathogen has been discovered to bolster the alternative explanations. The importance of hygiene was not recognized until the 19th century and the germ theory of disease. Until then, streets were usually unhygienic, with live animals and human parasites facilitating the spread of transmissible disease. By the early 14th century, so much filth had collected inside urban Europe that French and Italian cities were naming streets after human waste. In medieval Paris, several street names were inspired by merde, the French word for shit. There were rue Murdo, rue Murderson, rue Nerdison, rue des Murdens, and rue Murdières, well as a rue du Pippy pigs, cattle, chickens, geese, goats, and horses roamed the streets of medieval London and Paris, but medieval homeowners were supposed to police their house fronts, including removing animal dung, but most urbanites were careless. William E. Cosner, a resident of the London suburb of Farringdon, received a complaint alleging that men could not pass by his house for the stink of horse dung and horse piss. One irate Londoner complained that the runoff from the local slaughterhouse had made his garden stinking and putrid, while another charged that the blood from slain animals flooded nearby streets and lanes, making a foul corruption and abominable sight to all dwelling near. In much of medieval Europe, sanitation legislation consisted of an ordinance requiring homeowners to shout, "Look out below," 3 times before dumping a full chamber pot into the street. Early Christians considered bathing a temptation. With this danger in mind, Saint Benedict declared, "To those who are well, and especially to the young, bathing shall seldom be permitted." Saint Agnes took the injunction to heart and died without ever bathing. Territorial origins, according to a team of medical geneticists led by Mark H. Yersinia pestis, evolved in or near China over 2,600 years ago. Later research by a team led by Galina Eroshenko placed its origins more specifically in the Tian Shan Mountains on the border between Kyrgyzstan and China. However, more recent research notes that the previous sampling contained East Asian bias, and that sampling since then has discovered strains of Y. pestis in the Caucasus region previously thought to be restricted to China. There is also no physical or specific textual evidence of the Black Death in 14th century China. As a result, China's place in the sequence of the plague's spread is still debated to this day. According to Charles Creighton, records of epidemics in 14th century China suggests nothing more than typhus and major Chinese outbreaks of epidemic disease postdate the European epidemic by several years. The earliest Chinese descriptions of the bubonic plague do not appear until the 1640s. Nestorian gravesites, dating from 1338 to 1339, near Issyk have inscriptions referring to plague, which has led some historians and epidemiologists to think they mark the outbreak of the epidemic. This is supported by recent direct findings of Y. pestis DNA in teeth samples from graves in the area with inscriptions referring to pestilence as the cause of death. Epidemics killed an estimated 25 million across Asia during the 15 years before the Black Death reached Constantinople in 1347. The evidence does not suggest, at least at present, that these mortality crises were caused by plague, although some scholars, including McNeill and Cow, see the 1333 outbreak as a prelude to the outbreaks in Europe from the late 1340s to the early 1350s. Scholars of the Yuan and Ming periods remain skeptical about such an interpretation. Nonetheless, the remarkably high mortality rates during the Datong mortality should discourage us from rejecting the possibility of localized regional outbreaks of plague in different parts of China, albeit differing in scale from and unrelated to the pandemic mortality of the Black Death. What we lack is any indication of a plague pandemic that engulfed vast territories of the Yuan Empire and later moved into Western Eurasia through Central Asia. Philip Slavin. According to John Norris, evidence from Issyk indicates a small sporadic outbreak characteristic of transmission from rodents to humans with no wide-scale impact. According to Achman, the dating of the plague suggests that it was not carried along the Silk Road, and its widespread appearance in that region probably postdates the European outbreak. Additionally, The Silk Road had already been heavily disrupted before the spread of the Black Death. Western and Middle Eastern traders found it difficult to trade on the Silk Road by 1325 and impossible by 1340, making its role in the spread of plague less likely. There are no records of the symptoms of the Black Death from Mongol sources, or writings from travelers east of the Black Sea prior to the Crimean outbreak in 1346. Others still favor an origin in China. The theory of Chinese origin implicates the Silk Road, the disease possibly spreading alongside Mongol armies and traders, or possibly arriving via ship. However, this theory is still contested. It is speculated that rats aboard Zheng He's ships in the 15th century may have carried the plague to Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. Research on the Delhi Sultanate and the Yuan dynasty shows no evidence of any serious epidemic in 14th century India and no specific evidence of plague in 14th century China, suggesting that the Black Death may not have reached these regions. All Benedicto argues that since the first clear reports of the Black Death come from Kaffa, the Black Death most likely originated in the nearby plague focus on the northwestern shore of the Caspian Sea. Demographic historians estimate that China's population fell by at least 15%, and perhaps as much as a third, between 1340 and 1370. This population loss coincided with the Black Death that ravaged Europe and much of the Islamic world in 1347 to 52. However, there is a conspicuous lack of evidence for pandemic disease on the scale of the Black Death in China at this time. War and famine, and the diseases that typically accompanied them, probably were the main causes of mortality in the final decades of Mongol. Romonica Green suggests that other parts of Eurasia outside the West do not contain the same evidence of the Black Death, because there were actually 4 strains of Yersinia pestis that became predominant in different parts of the world. Mongol records of illness, such as food poisoning, may have been referring to the Black Death. Another theory is that the plague originated near Europe and cycled through the Mediterranean, northern Europe, and Russia before making its way to China. Other historians, such as John Norris and Ole Benedicta, believe the plague likely originated in Europe or the Middle East and never reached China. Norris specifically argues for an origin in Kurdistan rather than Central Asia. Plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe via Genoese traders from their port city of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1347, during a protracted siege of the city. In 1345 to 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde army of Johnny Beghus, mainly Tatar troops, were suffering from the disease catapulted infected corpses over the city walls of Kaffa to infect the inhabitants. Though it is also likely that infected rats traveled across the siege lines to spread the epidemic to the inhabitants. As the disease took hold, Genoese traders fled across the Black Sea to Constantinople, where the disease first arrived in Europe in summer 1347. 100. The epidemic there killed the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine Emperor John Sixto Cantacusenos, who wrote a description of the disease modeled on Thucydides' account of the 5th century BCE plague of Athens. Noting the spread of the Black Death by ship between maritime cities, 100 Nicephorus Gregoras, while writing to Demetrios Kydons, described the rising death toll, the futility of medicine, and the panic of the citizens. 100 The first outbreak in Constantinople lasted a year, but the disease recurred 10 times before 1400. 100 Carried by 12 Genoese galleys, plague arrived by ship in Sicily in October 1347. 101 The disease spreads rapidly all over the island, Galleys from Kaffa reached Genoa and Venice in January 1348. But it was the outbreak in Pisa a few weeks later that was the entry point into northern Italy. Towards the end of January, one of the galleys expelled from Italy arrived in Marseille. 102 from Italy. The disease spread northwest across Europe, striking France, Spain, Portugal, and England by June 1348, then spreading east and north through Germany, Scotland and Scandinavia from 1348 to 1350. It was introduced into Norway in 1349 when a ship landed at Aski, then spread to Bjørgvin, modern Bergen. 103 finally. It spread to northern Russia in 1352 and reached Moscow in 1353. 105. Plague was less common in parts of Europe with less established trade relations, including the majority of the Basque country, isolated parts of Belgium and the Netherlands, and isolated Alpine villages throughout the continent. 106, 107, 108, according to some epidemiologists. Periods of unfavorable weather decimated plague-infected rodent populations, forcing their fleas onto alternative hosts. 109 inducing plague outbreaks, which often peaked in the hot summers of the Mediterranean. 110, and during the cool autumn months of the southern Baltic region. 111d, among many other culprits of plague contagiousness. Pre-existing malnutrition weakened the immune response, contributing to an immense decline in European population. West Asian and North African outbreak. The disease struck various regions in the Middle East and North Africa during the pandemic, leading to serious depopulation and permanent change in both economic and social structures. 115, by autumn 1347, plague had reached Alexandria in Egypt, transmitted by sea from Constantinople via a single merchant ship carrying slaves. 116, by late summer 1348. It reached Cairo, capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, cultural center of the Islamic world, and the largest city in the Mediterranean basin. The Bahriya child Sultan an-Nasser Hazen fled, and more than a third of the 600,000 residents died. 117. The Nile was choked with corpses, despite Cairo having a medieval hospital. The late 13th century Bimaristan of the Kalawan complex. 117. The historian al-Makrizi described the abundant work for gravediggers and practitioners of funeral rites. Plague recurred in Cairo more than 50 times over the following 1.5 centuries. 117. During 1347, the disease traveled eastward to Gaza by April. By July it had reached Damascus, and in October plague had broken out in Aleppo. 116. That year, in the territory of modern Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, the cities of Ascalon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, and Homs were all infected. In 1348 to 1349, the disease reached Antioch. The city's residents fled to the north, but most of them ended up dying during the journey. 118. Within 2 years, the plague had spread throughout the Islamic world, from Arabia across North Africa. Page needed the pandemic spread westwards, from Alexandria along the African coast, while in April 1348 Tunis was infected by ship from Sicily. Tunis was then under attack by an army from Morocco. This army dispersed in 1348 and brought the contagion with them to Morocco, whose epidemic may also have been seeded from the Islamic city of Almeria in Al-Andalus. 116. Mecca became infected in 1348 by pilgrims performing the Hajj. 116. In 1351 or 1352, the Rasaud Sultan of the Yemen, Al-Mujahid Ali, was released from Mamluk captivity in Egypt and carried plague with him on his return home. 116-119. During 1349, records show the city of Mosul suffered a massive epidemic, and the city of Baghdad experienced a second round of the disease, and symptoms of the plague include fever of Y-41 degrees Celsius, HA-106 degrees Fahrenheit, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and a general feeling of malaise, left untreated. 80% of victims die within 8 days. 121 contemporary accounts of the pandemic are varied and often imprecise. The most commonly noted symptom was the appearance of buboes, or gaboxiolos, in the groin, neck, and armpits, which oozed pus and bled when opened. Boccaccio's description, in men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. From the two said parts of the body, this deadly gavacholo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous, as the gavatolo had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death. Such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. 123-124f. This was followed by acute fever and vomiting of blood. Most people died 2 to 7 days after initial infection. Freckle-like spots and rashes. 126, which may have been caused by flea. Pneumonic plague. Halogen, whose master Cardinal Giovanni Colonna died of plague in 1348, noted a distinct form of the disease, pneumonic plague, that infected the lungs and led to respiratory problems. Symptoms include fever, cough, and blood-tinged sputum. As the disease progresses, sputum becomes free-flowing and bright red. Pneumonic plague has a mortality rate of 90 to 95%. 127. Septicemic plague. Septicemic plague is the least common of the three forms, with an untreated mortality rate near 100%. Symptoms are high fevers and purple skin patches. Purpura due to disseminated intravascular coagulation. 127 in cases of pneumonic and particularly septicemic plague. The progress of the disease is so rapid that there would often be no time for the development of the enlarged lymph nodes that were noted as buboes. There are no exact figures for the death toll. The rate varied widely by locality. Urban centers with higher populations suffered longer periods of abnormal mortality. 128. Some estimate that it may have killed between 75 million and 200 million people in Eurasia. 129, 130, 131. Better source needed. A study published in 2022 of pollen samples across Europe from 1250 to 1450 was used to estimate changes in agricultural output before and after the Black Death. The authors found great variability in different regions, with evidence for high mortality in areas of Scandinavia, France, Western Germany, Greece, and central Italy, but uninterrupted agricultural growth in Central and Eastern Europe, Iberia, and Ireland. 132. The authors concluded that the pandemic was immensely destructive in some areas, but in others it had a far lighter touch. The study methodology invalidates histories of the Black Death that assume Y. pestis was uniformly prevalent, or nearly so, across Europe, and that the pandemic had a devastating demographic impact everywhere. The Black Death killed, by various estimations, from 25 to 60% of Europe's population. Robert Gottfried writes that as early as 1351, agents for Pope Clement VI calculated the number of dead in Christian Europe at 23,840,000, with a pre-plagued population of about 75 million. Clement's figure accounts for mortality of 31%, a rate about midway between the 50% mortality estimated for East Anglia, Tuscany, and parts of Scandinavia, and the less than 15% morbidity for Bohemia and Galicia, and it is unerringly close to. Froissart's claim that a third of the world died, a measurement probably drawn from St. John's figure of mortality from plague in the Book of Revelation, a favorite medieval source of information. 133 OLJ Benedicto proposes 60% mortality rate for Europe as a whole based on available data, with up to 80% based on poor nutritional conditions in the 14th century. 134-135 he. According to medieval historian Philip Daly, it is likely that over 4 years, 45 to 50% of the European population died of plague. 136h. The overwhelming number of deaths in Europe sometimes made mass burials necessary, and some sites had hundreds or thousands of bodies. 137. The mass burial sites that have been excavated have allowed archaeologists to continue interpreting and defining the biological, sociological, historical, and anthropological implications of the Black Death. 137. The mortality rate of the Black Death in the 14th century was far greater than the worst 20th century outbreaks of Y. pestis, plague, which occurred in India and killed as much as 3% of the population of certain cities. 138. In 1348, the disease spread so rapidly that nearly a third of the European population perished before any physicians or government authorities had time to reflect upon its origins. In crowded cities, it was not uncommon for as much as 50% of the population to die. Half of Paris's population of 100,000 people died. In Italy, the population of Florence was reduced from between 110,000 and 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 in 1351. At least 60% of the population of Hamburg and Bremen perished. 139, and a similar percentage of Londoners may have died from the disease as well, leaving a death toll of approximately 62,000 between 1346 and 1353. Florence's tax records suggest that 80% of the city's population died within 4 months in 1348. 138. Before 1350, there were about 170,000 settlements in Germany, and this was reduced by nearly 40,000 by 1450. 141. The disease bypassed some areas, with the most isolated areas being less vulnerable to contagion. Plague did not appear in Flanders until the turn of the 15th century, and the impact was less severe on the populations of Hainaut, Finland, northern Germany, and areas of Poland. 138. Monks, nuns, and priests were especially hard hit since they cared for people ill with the plague. 142. The level of mortality in the rest of Eastern Europe was likely similar to that of Western Europe in the first outbreak, with descriptions suggesting a similar effect on Russian towns, and the cycles of plague in Russia being roughly equivalent. In 1382, the physician to the Avignon papacy, Raimundo Chaumel, Divinario Latin, Magister Ramondis, lit. Master Raymond, observed the decreasing mortality rate of successive outbreaks of plague in 1347 to 1348, 1362, 1371 and 1382 in his treatise on epidemics De Epidemica. 143 in the first outbreak. 2/3 of the population contracted the illness, and most patients died. In the next, half the population became ill, but only some died. By the third, 1/10 were affected, and many survived. While by the fourth occurrence, only 1 in 20 people were sickened, and most of them survived. 143 by the 1380s in Europe. The plague predominantly affected children. 138 Calmel de Vinario recognized that bloodletting was ineffective, though he continued to prescribe bleeding for members of the Roman Curia, whom he disliked, and said that all true cases of plague were caused by astrological factors and were incurable. He was never able to effect a cure. 143 The populations of some Italian cities, notably Florence, did not regain their pre-14th century size until the 19th century. 144. Italian chronicler Agnolo di Torre recorded his experience from Siena, where plague arrived in May 1348. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds, both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Torre, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. 145 The most widely accepted estimate for the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran and Syria during this time, is for a death toll of about 1/3 of the population. 146 The Black Death killed about 40% of Egypt's population. 147 in Cairo, with a population numbering as many as 600,000, and possibly the largest city west of China. Between 1/3 and 40% of the inhabitants died within 8 months. 117 by the 18th century. The population of Cairo was halved from its numbers in 1347. 117 Economic kit has been suggested that the Black Death, like other outbreaks through history, disproportionately affected the poorest people and those already in worse physical condition than the wealthier citizens. 148 But along with population decline from the pandemic, wages soared in response to a subsequent labor shortage. 149 In some places rents collapsed, for example. Lettings used to bring in £5, and now but £1. 122 158 However, many labourers, artisans, and craftsmen, those living from money wages, alone suffered a reduction in real incomes owing to rampant inflation. 150 Landowners were also pushed to substitute monetary rents for labour services in an effort to keep tenants. 151 Taxes and tithes became difficult to collect, with living poor refusing to cover the share of the rich deceased, because many properties were empty and unfarmed, and because tax collectors, where they could be employed, refused to go to plague spots. 122 158 The trade disruptions in the Mongol Empire caused by the Black Death was one of the reasons for its collapse. 152 Environmental lay study performed by Thomas van Hoof of the Utrecht University suggests that the innumerable deaths brought on by the pandemic cooled the climate by freeing up land and triggering reforestation. This may have led to the Little Ice Age. Renewed religious fervor and fanaticism increased in the wake of the Black Death. Some Europeans targeted various groups such as Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, 154, 155, and Romani, blaming them for the crisis. Lepers, and others, with skin diseases such as acne or psoriasis, were killed throughout Europe. Because 14th century healers and governments were at a loss to explain or stop the disease, Europeans turned to astrological forces, earthquakes, and the poisoning of wells by Jews as possible reasons for outbreaks. Many believed the epidemic was a punishment by God for their sins, and could be relieved by winning God's forgiveness. 150. There were many attacks against Jewish communities. 157 in the Strasbourg massacre of February 1349. About 2,000 Jews were murdered. 157 in August 1349. The Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne were annihilated. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed. 158. During this period, many Jews relocated to Poland, where they received a welcome from King Casimir the Great. One theory that has been advanced is that the Black Death's devastation of Florence between 1348 and 1350 resulted in a shift in the worldview of people in 14th century Italy that ultimately led to the Renaissance. Italy was particularly badly hit by the pandemic, and the resulting familiarity with death may have caused thinkers to dwell more on their lives on earth, rather than on spirituality and the afterlife. 160J. It has also been argued that the Black Death prompted a new wave of piety, manifested in the sponsorship of religious works of art. 162. This does not fully explain why the Renaissance occurred in Italy in the 14th century. The Renaissance's emergence was most likely the result of the complex interaction of the above factors. 163. In combination with an influx of Greek scholars after the fall of the Byzantine Empire. 164. As a result of the drastic reduction in the populace, the value of the working class increased, and commoners came to enjoy more freedom to answer the increased need for labor. Workers traveled in search of the most favorable position economically. 165. Better source needed prior to the emergence of the Black Death. The continent was considered a feudalistic society composed of fiefs and city-states frequently managed by the Catholic Church. 166. The pandemic completely restructured both religion and political forces. Survivors began to turn to other forms of spirituality, and the power dynamics of the fiefs and city-states crumbled. 166, 167. The survivors of the pandemic found not only that the prices of food were lower, but also that lands were more abundant, and many of them inherited property from their dead relatives, and this probably contributed to the destabilization of feudalism. 168, 169. The word quarantine has its roots in this period, though the practice of isolating people to prevent the spread of disease is older. In the city-state of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, Croatia, a 30-day isolation period was implemented in 1377 for new arrivals to the city from plague-affected areas. The isolation period was later extended to 40 days, and given the name quarantino from the Italian word for 40. 170. All institutions were affected. Smaller monasteries and convents became unviable and closed. Up to half parish churches lost their priest, apart from the parishioners. Religious sensibilities changed. 122. Looking back into the past. The history of the Church during the Middle Ages in England appears one continuous and stately progress. It is much nearer to the truth to say that in 1351 the whole ecclesiastical system was wholly disorganized, or, indeed, more than half ruined, and that everything had to be built up anew to secure the most necessary public ministrations of the rites of religion. The most inadequately prepared subjects had to be accepted, and even these could be obtained only in insufficient numbers. The immediate effect on the people was a religious paralysis. Instead of turning men to God, the scourge turned them to despair. In time, the religious sense and feeling revived, but in many respects it took a new tone, and its manifestations ran in new channels characterized by a devotional and more self-reflective cast than previously. The new religious spirit found outward expression in the multitude of guilds which sprang into existence at this time, in the remarkable and almost, as it may seem to some, extravagant development of certain pious practices, in the singular spread of a more personal devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, to the Blessed Virgin, to the Five Wounds, to the Holy Name, and other such manifestations of a more tender or more familiar piety. At the close of the 14th century and during the course of the 15th, the supply of ornaments, furniture, plate, statues painted or in highly decked coats, with which the churches were literally encumbered as time went on, proved a striking contrast to the comparative simplicity which characterized former days, as witnessed by a comparison of inventories. In fact, the 15th century witnessed the beginnings of a great middle-class movement, which can be distinctly traced to the effect of the great pestilence. The plague repeatedly returned to haunt Europe and the Mediterranean throughout the 14th to 17th centuries. 171, according to Jean Norby, the plague was present somewhere in Europe in every year between 1346 and 1671. Although some researchers have cautions about the uncritical use of Byroban's data, 170 to 173, the second pandemic was particularly widespread in the following years: 1360 to 1363, 1374, 1400, 1438 to 1439, 1456 to 1457, 1464 to 1466, 1481 to 1485, 1500 to 1503, 1518 to 1531, 1544 to 1548, 1563 to 1566, 1573 to 1588, 1596 to 1599, 1602 to 1611, 1623 to 1640, 1644 to 1654, and 1664 to 1667. Subsequent outbreaks, though severe, marked the plague's retreat from most of Europe 18th century and North Africa 19th century. 174 historian George Sussman argued that the plague had not occurred in East Africa until the 20th century. However, other sources suggest that the second pandemic did indeed reach sub-Saharan Africa. 115, according to historian Geoffrey Parker. France alone lost almost 1 million people to the plague in the epidemic of 1628 to 31. 175, in the first half of the 17th century, a plague killed some 1.7 million people in Italy. 176, more than 1.25 million deaths resulted from the extreme incidence of plague in 17th century Spain. 177, the Black Death ravaged much of the Islamic world. 178, plague could be found in the Islamic world almost every year between 1500 and 1850. Sometimes the outbreaks affected small areas, while other outbreaks affected multiple regions. 179, plague repeatedly struck the cities of North Africa. Algiers lost 30,000 to 50,000 inhabitants to it in 1622-1621. and again in 1654 to 1657, 1665, 1691, and 1740 to 1742. 180 Cairo suffered more than 50 plague epidemics within 150 years from the plague's first appearance, with the final outbreak of the second pandemic there in the 1840s. 117. Plague remained a major event in Ottoman society until the second quarter of the 19th century, between 1701 and 1750. 37 larger and smaller epidemics were recorded in Constantinople, and an additional 31 between 1751 and 1800. 181 Baghdad has suffered severely from visitations of the plague, and sometimes 2/3 of its population died. Labor crisis and peasant revolts after so many died, surviving peasants found themselves in demand. Wages rose, but the nobility fought back passing labor laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. Frustrated peasants rebelled across Europe, from the 1358 French Jacquerie to uprisings in Germany and England. The old feudal order was shaking. How the Black Death made life better, the mortality destroyed more than 1/3 of the men, women, and children. Such a shortage of workers ensued that the humble turned up their noses at employment, and could scarcely be persuaded to serve the eminent unless for triple wages. As a result, churchmen, knights, and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plough the land, and perform every other unskilled task if they are to make their own bread in its entry on the Black Death. The 1347 to 50 outbreak of bubonic plague that killed at least 1/3 of Europe's population. This chronicle from the English city of Rochester includes, among its harrowing details, a seemingly trivial lament. Aristocrats and high clergymen not only had to pay triple wages to those toiling in their fields, but, even worse, they themselves had to perform manual labor. Curiously, the documentary record, which provides ample evidence that workers did demand and receive higher wages on which more below, contains in contrast scant evidence that worthies ever dirtied their hands with fieldwork, even if, or especially, as phantasms. However, these sickle-wielding lords reveal the importance of imagined possibilities in shaping pandemic responses. The eminent refused to take on menial roles, not because they could not perform these unskilled tasks, but because to do so would be unworthy of their social rank, and it was unthinkable to abandon that social and labor hierarchy. Farm work was peasant work, whether performed by serfs bound to a particular manor, tenants, farmers, or wage laborers hired by the year or the season. But the staggering mortality of the Black Death reduced this previously sufficient peasant population sharply enough to create a severe labor shortage. What happened next has been the subject of an enormous amount of scholarship, particularly in the case of England, where the large extant body of sources, such as chronicles, legislation, court cases, and manorial account books, provides rich material for studying the social and economic changes in the wake of the Black Death. Scholars disagree about how and how much things changed, but they share a tendency to describe these changes in oddly passive terms. Wages rose, inequality decreased, feudalism ended. Yet there was a great deal of deliberate inaction behind these developments. Rather than supply some of the needed labor themselves, landowners turned to solutions that might produce the kind of world they were capable of imagining. In England, they created first the Ordinance 1349 and then the Statute 1351 of labourers, which froze wages at pre-plague levels, compelled workers not otherwise engaged in fixed, long-term employment into year-long contracts with the first employer who demanded it, and established penalties to ensure compliance. as Jane Whittle has noted, in putting their efforts behind the control of waged labor rather than the retrenchment of already declining supply. Rural landowners sought a thinkable resolution to this impasse. They would use the existing market for labor, but control the terms of exchange. Many peasants, however, refused to play their assigned role of deferential wage earner. Court records from 1352, for example, show that Edward Law of Wooton, employee of the prior and convent of Bradenstoke, left his employment before the feast of St. Nicholas, the 6th of December, without permission or reasonable cause contrary to statute, and that John Death of Rotten demanded an excess of 6 shillings 8 pence for reaping John Lovell's corn. Recalcitrant labourers remained a problem in 1374, when John Fisher, William Thecker, William Ferns, John Dyker, Gilbert Child, Alan Tasker, Stephen Lang, John Hardlard, Cecilia Cotter, Joan, daughter of Henry Cooer, Metillus de Ely, Alice, wife of Simon Souter, all of Bardney, labourers, refused to work for the Abbot of Bardney at the stipulated wages, and on the same day they left the town to get higher wages elsewhere, in contempt of the king and contrary to statute. With many state governments reducing unemployment benefits to push workers to fill open jobs, the aim, like England after the Black Death, is to reinstate and reinforce previous social and labour hierarchies, regardless of whose work has actually been essential over the past 16 months. These records attest to some individuals' appreciation of the increased value of their labour in the new marketplace created by mass death. The number and geographical range of these individual acts of defiance, moreover, suggest a vibrant, if unrecorded, current of communal discussions, rumours and calculations that supported such individual agency. In the face of official intransigence, workers pushed for higher wages and greater mobility, which they received because churchmen, knights, and other worthies were willing to make these concessions, rather than have to work the fields and herd the sheep themselves. As a result, wages rose, inequality lessened, and the social and labour hierarchies remained the same. Thankfully, the current COVID-19 pandemic is vastly less lethal than the mid-14th century bubonic plague, and we can hope that people around the world do not experience the loss of human life on the same scale. What the Black Death does share with our present moment is the issue of labour and the limits. Drawn by the negative space of the unthinkable, the people who prospered under the pre-pandemic system are now deciding what back to normal looks like and how we get there, with many state governments reducing unemployment benefits to push workers to fill open jobs. The aim, like England after the Black Death, is to reinstate and reinforce previous social and labour hierarchies, regardless of whose work has actually been essential over the past 16 months. Workers in specific circumstances and with individual or collective determination might negotiate better labour conditions or higher wages, but these concessions' permanence remains in the hands of employers who saw no reason to implement them prior to the pandemic. As historians Ada Palmer and Eleanor Janiger have argued, whatever gains peasants and artisans obtained in the decades after the Black Death did not survive the following centuries. Elites successfully reclaimed a greater share of wealth and income. Hierarchies ossified, and labourers' power diminished, simply stating that English society was changed by the Black Death not only discounts the people who did the changing, but also ignores the insufficiencies of the changes they produced. The Rochester chronicler raised the spectre of knights and churchmen, toiling in the fields to evoke the unthinkable scale of the disaster, and then refused to contemplate this radically different social order any further. We are not the Rochester chronicler, how can we think the unthinkable about safety and health, racial justice, gender roles, immigration status, access to childcare, and the dignity, autonomy, and worth of labor for our own post-pandemic future? All quoted material from Rosemary Horrocks ed. The Black Death, Manchester University Press, 1994. Part 4. Commoner Life, Work Without Relief for the Common Folk. Daily life was endless toil. Medieval farmers used simple tools like plows, sickles, and no fertilizer. Most didn't taste meat. Bread made of rye or oats was their staple. Women worked long hours at both field and hearth. The average life expectancy was under 40. Many died in childhood. Popular revolts in late medieval Europe are historical uprisings and rebellions by peasants in the countryside, or the burgesses in towns, against nobles, abbots, and kings during the upheavals between 1300 and 1500, part of a larger crisis of the late Middle Ages. Although sometimes known as peasant revolts, the phenomenon of popular uprisings was of broad scope and not just restricted to peasants. In Central Europe and the Balkan region, these rebellions expressed and helped cause a political and social disunity, paving the way for the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Before the 14th century, popular uprisings, such as uprisings at a manor house against an unpleasant overlord, though not unknown, tended to operate on a local scale. This changed in the 14th and 15th centuries when new downward pressures on the poor resulted in mass movements of popular uprisings across Europe. For example, Germany between 1336 and 1525 witnessed no fewer than 60 instances of militant peasant unrest. Most of the revolts expressed the desire of those below to share in the wealth, status, and well-being of those more fortunate. In the end, they were almost always defeated by the nobles. A new attitude emerged in Europe, that peasant was a pejorative concept. It was something separate and seen in a negative light from those who had wealth and status. This was an entirely new social stratification from earlier times when society had been based on the three orders: those who work, those who pray, and those who fight, when being a peasant meant being next to God. Just like the other orders, the main reasons cited for these mass uprisings are an increasing gap between the wealthy and poor, declining incomes of the poor, rising inflation, taxation, the external crises of famine, plague, war, and religious conflict. The social gap between rich and poor had become more extreme. The origins of this change can be traced to the 12th century and the rise of the concept of nobility. Dress, behavior, courtesy, speech, diet, education all became part of the noble class, making them distinct from others. By the 14th century, the nobles had indeed become very different in their behavior, appearance, and values from those beneath. The nobles, however, also faced a crisis of declining income. By 1285, inflation had become rampant, in part due to population pressures, and some nobles charged rent based on customary fixed rates, based on the feudal system. So, as the price of goods and services rose from inflation, the income of those nobles remained stagnant, effectively dropping. To make matters worse, the nobles had become accustomed to a more luxurious lifestyle that required more money. To address this, nobles illegally raised rents, cheated, stole, and sometimes resorted to outright violence to maintain this lifestyle. Kings who needed money to finance wars resorted to devaluing currency by cutting silver and gold coins with less precious metal, which resulted in increased inflation and, in the end, increased tax rates. The 14th century crises of famine, plague, and war put additional pressures on those at the bottom. The plague, in particular, drastically reduced the numbers of people who were workers and producing the wealth. Finally, layered on top of this was a popular ideological view of the time that property, wealth, and inequality were against the teachings of God, as expressed through the teachings of the Franciscans. The sentiment of the time was probably best expressed by preacher John Ball during the English peasant revolt, when he said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, criticizing economic inequality as human-made rather than a creation of God." Cultural shock, faith, fear, and social collapse. With famine and plague rampant, people turned to prayer, but the church failed many. Chroniclers called the plague more final than Noah's flood. Some shrines were deserted as spiritual authority crumbled. Europe entered a prolonged crisis, forcing social, moral, and religious transformation. The harsh life of the medieval commoner. Medieval commoners were the backbone of medieval society. Commoners were people without significant social status, not part of the nobility, aristocracy, or royal family. These people made up the large majority of the population of medieval Britain. But what was life like for the average commoner in historic England? For the common masses, life was not one of ease and luxury. It consisted of toiling in the fields, working long hours for lords under a feudal system, and struggling to stay one step ahead of an early death from disease and starvation. After a long day in the fields, many medieval commoners could look forward to returning home to dwellings plagued by fleas and lice. The large majority could expect not to make it past 40 years of age. However, the life of a commoner wasn't one that only consisted of hardship and mundanity. Commoners enjoyed music, festivals, and storytelling. Read more: pest houses in England that are still standing today. They fought against the upper classes and government to try and improve their living conditions. The lives, beliefs, and activities of the common people became the foundation on which Britain was built. Many didn't live past the age of 40, and death during childhood was a common occurrence. So common, in fact, that some estimates claim that up to a third of children in the Middle Ages perished before reaching their 5th birthday. As many as 25% of medieval children may not have lived to see their 1st birthday. A further 6% would die between the ages of 6 and 9. Disease, starvation, war, and injury posed a constant risk to all levels of medieval society, but particularly to medieval commoners. Plagues, such as the Black Death, had a disproportionate impact on the peasant population of the UK. Squalid and cramped conditions, and few means to escape the advance of the disease across the country, led to high death rates among English commoners. Bound to the land, many commoners in medieval Britain were farmers working the land for a lord. Under the feudal system, the lower classes, made up significantly of commoners, had very restricted lives. There were few avenues to improve their economic and social standing. This system lasted from the 10th to the 15th century. It existed on the basis of land rights filtering down through society to the peasant classes in order to get land to farm. Many commoners, known as serfs, became essentially legally bound to the land that they farmed and the lord that the land belonged to. In this setup, serfs were responsible for producing enough food and other products, such as wool or flax, to sustain themselves and their family. In addition, they were responsible for working the land for wealthy landowning lords. Read more: From Commons to Closures, the Enclosure Act's impact on British landscape serfs. were expected to do everything from ploughing the land to harvesting crops, threshing and winnowing grain, and even cutting and collecting wood and hay for the Lord. However, not every commoner was bound by this restrictive land agreement. There were also freemen. Freemen rented or owned their own land and often pursued entrepreneurial endeavors, practicing trades or starting small businesses to support themselves. While the life of freemen was still often a harsh existence, they did have more freedom than the average serf. This mixture of mud, straw, and manure provided a building material that was relatively strong when it dried. Most windows did not contain glass, but were simply holes in the wall, perhaps covered with shutters, or sometimes just a curtain, making these houses particularly susceptible to winter chills. It was not uncommon for entire piliers to share a dwelling with just 1 or 2 rooms. Animals would also likely be brought inside at night to protect them from predators, thieves, and adverse weather. Read more. Drove roads. What are they? Mattresses would be made from straw, and a lack of access to hygiene and running water meant that fleas, lice, grime, dirt, and bacteria were all a part of everyday life for commoners. Local rivers, lakes, and wells provided water for medieval families. However, these were also often sites where human waste was deposited, creating a constant risk of disease. The Great Famine. Medieval commoners were no strangers to hunger, with various reports of periods of famine and food scarcity throughout medieval times. The Great Famine that hit England in the 1300s is thought to have killed as many as 5% of the British population. There are accounts of people eating dogs and horses to try and survive. When there was food, a medieval diet didn't provide a great deal of variety. Most peasants ate a diet consisting of stew made of beef and vegetables such as leek and cabbage, as well as cheese and bread, as food sources could become unreliable if crops failed or animals died. Many commoners also relied on pickled and salted foods to get through hungrier times. Many children didn't have access to education and would work alongside their parents in the fields from a young age. Along with a rigid class system, this lack of education or the ability to be trained in a trade meant that it was difficult for people to escape the cycle of poverty that many commoners found themselves trapped in. Read more. Occupational surnames. Where does yours come from? However, there were points of light in what could seem like a bleak existence. Villages often had a rich calendar of festivals and events that medieval commoners could enjoy. Music and storytelling were also popular pastimes. Wandering entertainers would roam from town to town, bringing music and entertainment for local people. Taxes. Taxes and more. Taxes, being a commoner in medieval times, meant having to pay taxes. Taxes charged to commoners were at times excessive and relentless. Taxes were charged by the church, by parliament, and sometimes directly by the monarch. These taxes were often used to fund things like military campaigns. However, this was not all. Taxes were imposed for a medieval tax known as aid could be imposed by a lord for instances such as the marriage of his eldest daughter, the knighting of his son, to fund his crusade, or to pay his ransom. A large percentage of the income of the royal household and upper classes came in the form of taxes. For poor commoners, taxes represented a constant struggle for those already economically disadvantaged. Although taxes were paid in cash, there are instances when they were also paid by alternative means. There are accounts of taxes being paid in seed and grain, and even farming equipment being handed over to cover the cost. Read more. Wat Tyler, the young rebel who changed England's history, giving up seed to cover tax. Though was a risky business. This could leave medieval farmers without enough seed for the next year's planting season. However, in some cases, poor serfs were exempt from taxation as they didn't own the land they worked. This was the case for a tax known as the geld, which existed in the 9th and 10th century and was largely used for funding military and defense efforts. A religious existence throughout medieval Britain, the influence of the church represented a core part of everyday life. Taxes, known as tithes, were paid to the church. In some cases, these were as high as 10% of earnings. Although the Black Death and the social upheaval that followed it challenged the church's power, it still remained an influential institution. Medieval Britain was a deeply religious place, and the church was viewed to hold authority from God. As such, the church, for most people in the country, represented and dictated how they should live everyday life and the morals by which they would lead their lives. Revolts and revolutions, not all commoners were willing to simply accept the harsh conditions forced upon them from the upper and aristocratic classes. There are a few accounts of peasants fighting back against the restrictions imposed on them, none perhaps as famous as the Peasants' Revolt. Read more. The mighty medieval tithe, Barnes also known as the Great Rising. This revolt happened in 1381. It resulted in the sacking of the Tower of London, mass executions, and charters being granted to rebel towns, rooted in economic and social issues that were impacted in part by rising taxes. The aftermath of the Black Death and war with France, the final tipping point that sparked the peasants' revolt, was a violent confrontation with a royal official who was trying to collect unpaid taxes. This event sparked villagers across England's southeast to rise up, seeking an end to serfdom. They demanded lower taxes and changes in the law courts and senior officials of King Richard II. Once the rebels reached London, they sacked Savoy Palace, attacked jails, murdered those associated with the royal government, and set fire to buildings and law books. On the 14th of June 1381, while a 14-year-old King Richard II met with the rebels, agreeing to their demand of the end of serfdom, other rebel forces breached the Tower of London. Once inside, they killed both the Lord Chancellor and the Lord High Treasurer. Violence again broke out the next day between Richard's forces and the rebels. A militia was gathered by the government. The agreement made between Richard and rebels was rescinded by November 1381. The rebellion had been quashed, and many of the rebel leaders had been found and executed, leaving a mark on history. Medieval commoners may have had hard and often short lives, but they left their mark on history. They battled disease and hunger, and many lived with few rights or freedoms. However, they still managed to find light and enjoyment, enjoying songs, stories, and festivals.